Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Shardlight for PC. This is an adventure game by Wadjet Eye Games that was released in March of this year to pretty good reception. Most people seem to enjoy it, although there were a few issues that were reported with it that I'll get to more when I get to the story and the gameplay. It is a bit of a departure from what we're used to in terms of Wadjet Eye Games because this is a post-apocalyptic game, so it's the first time they really tried to jump into that. But regardless of how different it is from what we're used to as far as Wadjet Eye Games go, it's really more of a matter of, is this up to their quality standard? Because Wadjet Eye has been pretty much at the tip of the spear for the indie adventure game renaissance. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out how it stacks up to their other releases and whether or not it's a particularly good adventure game in and of itself. Well, as far as presentation goes, honestly I don't really have much to complain about here because it's pretty much up to the same quality standards that we're used to from other Wadjet Eye releases. The sprite work is excellent, it's very well detailed, the animations are generally pretty smooth and fluid for what they are, which is of course old school adventure game pixel art style. The portraits that pop up when the various characters are speaking are very well detailed, the environments themselves are absolutely packed with detail, and generally speaking, despite a rather drab color scheme for the most part, where pretty much everything is a different shade of brown, it does still manage to have bits of color in it. It's a post-apocalyptic wasteland, sure, but there's still some bright greens. There's various colors scattered all over the place that are actually very refreshing. It's not just brown and gray and realistic, and that's certainly greatly appreciated. Moving on to the sound design, you find that things get a bit murkier because the soundtrack, while very well done and very fitting for the post-apocalyptic vibe they're going for, isn't really all that memorable. It's what I would describe as kind of generic post-apocalyptic music. It's not the kind of stuff that really stands out to you like, say, the Mark Morgan soundtrack for the original Fallout or even for Wasteland 2. So while it is a bit disappointing that the soundtrack doesn't stick out more, at least it's still very fitting and is very well done. The voice acting is pretty much what we would expect from Wadjet Eye Games at this point, where the actual voice acting for an indie game is pretty fantastic. All of the characters are voiced very well and actually manage to pull off emotions pretty well, which does help the game out quite a bit in the long run. But what doesn't help it out so much are the sound effects, which are just average. They work pretty well for what they are, and that's about it. There's nothing that really stands out. But then again, in a game like this, you don't really need sound effects that stand out too much. It's really much more about the actual environments, the artwork, and the voice acting than it is about the simple details like sound effects. And that's because in an adventure game, you're going to be focusing a lot more on the dialogue and on the environments and the various animations that are going on than you are on the actual sound effects, because the sound effects only pop up every so often, whereas the others you're dealing with pretty much constantly. So in nearly every spot where it counts, the presentation in Shardlight is excellent for what it is, which is an indie adventure game, and it's up to the quality standard we would expect from Wadjet Eye at this point. It's just a shame that the soundtrack isn't particularly memorable. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although since this is an adventure game, the story really does take precedence here, as do the characters. The setting is a post-apocalyptic future, about 20 years after World War III occurred and pretty much wiped the floor with everything. And in this grimdark future you have the aristocrats who rule over the city pretty much with an iron fist, but not quite. Because it's really more of a matter of they look out for their own and they're looking to hold on to whatever power they actually have, but they just kind of ignore everyone else. They act like they don't exist or they marginalize them. And you play as Amy Wellard, who starts the game off doing a lottery job for the aristocrats, where the lottery is basically a way of getting vaccines for the plague that's going around known as the green lung. The green lung is always fatal, and there is no cure for it. The only way you can treat it is to be given a vaccine basically once a month, and this will prevent you from dying a very horrible, very painful death. The thing is, I'm not entirely sure if they understood how vaccines work, because vaccines are supposed to prevent you from getting the disease, not treat you once you've gotten it. But that's more of an issue of semantics than anything else. The point is that Amy does in fact have the green lung. She started suffering from the symptoms recently, and she's trying to keep it under wraps as best she can, even though she really can't keep it under wraps very well. And thus, of course, being desperate for the vaccine, she goes on this lottery job where she actually finds the previous technician who went in there to try to fix the reactor she's been sent to fix, who is pinned under some rubble and is dying. And as his dying wish, of course, after you fix the reactor, he asks you to deliver a letter to someone named Danton. And it turns out that Danton is a member of the Resistance. Of course, the problem with that is that she actually is sort of kind of working for the aristocracy, because they pretty much force her to become a double agent for the Resistance and the aristocracy, and from there the plot actually becomes incredibly predictable. That's really its major problem. The plot in this is very predictable, and the storytelling just tends to be fairly weak. While the voice actors definitely do an admirable job giving their characters quite a bit of life, and the characters themselves are actually not too bad, in fact several of them are very interesting, the real problem becomes that the story itself is just so by the numbers, so to speak. You can see all the big reveals in this game coming from a mile away, and it just makes it kind of hard to get into the story if you pretty much know what's going to happen from the get-go, just because it's not really doing anything you haven't seen before. That's not to say the story is outright bad or anything, it's just kind of by the numbers and really just becomes bland and uninteresting. Which is of course a problem because the gameplay doesn't really do all that much to bring things up. This is a point-and-click adventure game, which does mean that the meat of the actual gameplay is going to be puzzles and not much else. The vast majority of your time spent in this game is actually in dialogue, going around talking to people, and that's perfectly fine. It's just that the puzzles themselves really aren't that difficult, and most of them are really just a matter of, do I see what I need to see, and do I know exactly what I need to do at this particular point, not so much how do I do this. And that was part of the problem as well. When I got stuck on something, it wasn't because the puzzle was ingenious, it was because I had just missed something that I didn't know was there, and it just took me a while to find it. Again, like the story, there's nothing really wrong with that, it just means that the puzzles become more frustrating than they are satisfying to solve. And since the rest of the game is spent just going around talking to people and finding items, it means that the gameplay itself just really isn't all that satisfying. It's not terrible, it's certainly not the worst adventure game I've ever played or anything like that, but the real problem here is that this is something that only really adventure game fans are going to be able to get much out of. It's got solid enough characters, the world itself is actually fairly interesting, it's just a shame that they don't really explore it as much as they could, and while the story itself is extremely predictable, there's nothing really outright wrong with it, other than just the fact that it can be kind of bland and uninteresting at times, partly because it is just so standard. I mean, let's face it, whenever you have some sort of hyper-rich aristocracy seeing over everything and the rest of the people are all poor, starving, dying of horrible diseases, that sort of thing, you pretty much know how it's gonna go. Although it is nice that they do give you 3 options when you finally get to the end, so you actually end up with 3 different endings depending on what you choose in that last point. But unfortunately, it's just that one decision at the end of the game. It's not a matter of your decision throughout the course of the game mattering at the end. It's just a matter of, well, you pick something arbitrarily at the end and that's the ending you get. Which is, of course, somewhat disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. And that's really the major problem I have with Shardlight. It's not that it's a bad game. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that I was kind of expecting a lot more out of it considering how Wadjet Eye has been over the years. They just seem to have been getting better and better and better, and then all of a sudden they release a Golden Wake, which admittedly was not developed by Wadjet Eye, and now they release Shardlight, which is still solid, it's just kind of disappointing. It's certainly not enough to ruin the game, it certainly has its moments, and if you're an adventure game fan, you should be able to get plenty out of it. It's just that it's harder to recommend to newer people to the genre, or people who aren't really adventure game fans to begin with, because if you're going to go with that route, then there are other games out there, even by Wadjet Eye, that are a better choice, like say the Blackwell series. But when it comes to Shardlight, since it's a Wadjet Eye production, I was expecting more, and what I got was just a solid enough adventure game that's worth playing if you're into the genre. But if you're not a fan of the genre already, this is definitely not going to be the game that converts you. I ultimately give it a 3 out of 5 with that stipulation, where if you're an adventure game fan, you should definitely pick it up and give it a try, because you'll be able to get something out of it. For everybody else, it's more of a matter of, well, try it out first. There's a demo available, so try that first, and if you like that, maybe you should get the full game. So once again, 3 out of 5 with that stipulation. Thanks for watching.